So as Jessica said, we're talking about an evolution here. And one thing that I think, as she said, is interesting that we need to keep in mind two things are happening. A death camp system developing, and also how does Auschwitz develop along with that. So we'll sort of be looking at two things as we move through this tonight. To start with, again, back to her introduction, talking about, we think about Auschwitz as this peak of industrialized killing. We think of it as a factory of death, right? A factory that is very efficient at producing its product. Harnessing the might of the industry of the West, we think that this is where the Nazis started. And as Jessica pointed out, that wasn't the case. And so this is actually a quote from a man who was a guard at Sobibor in Treblinka. And when he was interviewed years later by Claude Lanzmann doing Shoah, Franz Suchemel said, Belzec was the laboratory, Auschwitz was the factory. And so tonight I want to take us through that process, starting in the laboratory and ending up in the factory that you're so familiar with. It's fantastic that so many of you have seen the exhibit, because I think a lot of these things that I talk about will seem a bit familiar, and hopefully we can flesh out some of the knowledge that you already have. But it'll be nice to sort of piece all those things together. So again, mentioning Jessica's introduction, thinking about what Europe looks like in this moment. So before we just jump right into death camp stuff, what else is happening in Europe? How do we get to that moment? I always like to start with a map. Who doesn't? I think it's a nice place to sort of orient us. And it shows us the Jewish population of Europe in 1939. So let's just have sort of a quick backup. What's been happening in Europe over the last 6 years? 1933, that's when Hitler comes to power. And over those early 30s, that's when you see a lot of anti-Jewish legislation go into effect in Germany, right? So Hitler's only controlling Germany. And the population, the Jewish population of Germany, in 1933 was a little bit larger than this. You can see in 1939, it's about 300,000. 1933, it was about 600,000. So it was a little bit higher. And so in those early 30s, you see restrictions against German Jews. Then, as we know, Hitler moves on and starts acquiring territory around him, right? He goes into the Sudetenland, he gets Austria, eventually Czechoslovakia. So once he goes into those territories, he'll gain some more Jews, but not significant numbers, right? So the early 30s and then later 30s are about legal restrictions and expanding into these nearby territories. At that moment, the policy towards the Jews is about forcing them to get out of German-held territory. They're not looking to kill them, they're not looking to do anything other than move them outside of territory that they control. And that's doable in their mind because the numbers aren't that great. So if you look up there on the eve of war in 39, you can see that, you know, we're only talking about several 100,000 Jewish people in those territories. So that's the policy prior to the war. Once the war starts in September of 1939 and the Nazis move into Poland, now look at the population they're dealing with. It's significantly larger, right? 3 million people Jewish people are now under this sphere of control. So the Nazis aren't sure what they want to do next. They don't really know what the next step is, but they do know that they want to concentrate these people, and so they put them in ghettos. They're easier to control, easier to identify, and so we see a policy of ghettoization happening in the 1930s in Poland. Poland is divided up by the Nazis and then by the Soviet Union. Eventually, as we know, the Nazis will break that non-aggression pact and go ahead and move into the Soviet-controlled areas of Poland and into the Soviet Union. So in June of 1941, the Nazis invade the Soviet Union. When they do, we again see the vast numbers of Jewish people that they will be encountering. Their policy when they move into Soviet territory is one of mass murder. They'll start mass shooting actions. So if we pause here in 1941, we've got Soviet Jews are being shot, Polish Jews are ghettoized, and Jews in the West are at home. They're under legal restrictions, but they're at home. So there's a real divide geographically in what's happening to Europe's Jewish population. So that sort of orients us. So now if we look at the beginnings of genocide, like I mentioned, when the Nazis move into Soviet territory in June of 41, they will start mass shooting actions. And so all of these red and blue dots represent massacre sites across Eastern Europe. Some cases there may be 100 people shot, sometimes 60, sometimes 30,000, right? So there's a real variance in number of people that are killed, but over the time that these mobile killing units are shooting their way across Eastern Europe, just over 1.5 million people are killed. So it is a significant number when you think about the hand-to-hand killing that this is. Sometimes we call this the Holocaust by bullets, and if you were in the exhibit, you might recognize there is a pointer on here. Is it that? Yes. You might recognize this photo. That's in the exhibit that you may have seen. And this is a woman and her child who are basically waiting to be shot. This type of killing was very personal. It was also very difficult on the killers. There was a lot of soldiers who didn't want to do it or did it and then engaged in a lot of alcoholism. It was expensive, took a lot of bullets, and they're also fighting a war with the Soviet Union. So there are many reasons why this type of killing wasn't something they moved forward on. So also in the summer of 41, there's now a plan that's taken to actually go forward with the development of a solution to kill all of Europe's Jews. So the situational killing that was happening with the Einsatzgruppen, that was definitely the prelude to genocidal action, but there wasn't an overall policy. But in July of 41, Berlin will decide now we're proceeding with the sort of research and development phase for the final solution. How can we best kill all 9.5 million Jewish people living in Europe? So they'll look at a variety of solutions. Like I said, they're moving away from the shooting because it's expensive, it's taxing on the killers, it's slow, and it takes a lot of manpower. And again, if you know anything about Germans in war, they're always short of manpower. So this isn't the best solution for them. So one of the things they look at are gas fans, and that's what you see pictured there. Simple idea of the gas being recycled back into the hold, and so people are being killed by gassing. And one of the killing centers, Chelmno, will always use that form of killing. People are loaded into the trucks, they're driven around on a track or on the road, and then the bodies are disposed of. This too had problems. One, it was still the Germans themselves were the ones who were doing it, the loading and the unloading of the trucks, and they found that still, they were a little squeamish about that. There was a variance in gas produced, so if you drove too fast or too slow, not everyone died. So it wasn't as efficient as they wanted. So the next thing that they try are stationary gas chambers. And for those of you who joined us last week for our panel on non-Jewish victims or on the Hitler's first victims that we had Beth Greek-Polelli talk about the euthanasia program, you might remember that the T4 euthanasia program is where they first started using stationary gas chambers with carbon monoxide disguised as showers. So that was a method they'd tried before, and the people of Germany, they decide that's a method that they can transport to the east. And in fact, many of the men who are working in that T4 euthanasia program will be sent to the east to head up some of these killing facilities. So they're going to use their experience from one killing facility and implement it in another location. In T4, they were using bottled carbon monoxide. In these camps, they will use diesel engines, often a tank engine that will be hooked up to a gas chamber, and then that will produce the gas. This way, it takes less people to run the system. You're bringing the people you're going to kill to one stationary location. And now they're going to make the prisoners, who they're not killing immediately, do the gruesome work of body disposal. So it's alleviating that difficulty they were having with some of the body disposal. So that's all, they've decided these things, but it isn't until January of 42 that they will officially ratify it. So some of the death camps are even under construction, but now they're going to sort of rubber stamp it January 20th, 1942. The meeting was supposed to be held earlier in December, like December 8th, but then Pearl Harbor happened, so they had to move it back because a lot of the people who were involved in this meeting also got called away for important we're at war with America business. So then finally they say they can't delay it any longer, and they once again schedule this meeting for January 20th. Here it is, everything's in place, they just need the various departments of government to know, this is what you're going to do, we're going to need your help this way, and we're moving forward. So sometimes people say the final solution was decided at Wannsee. It was not decided. Everything was in the works, ground has been broken, it's being ratified at this moment. So now, in the spring of 42, we'll see the beginnings of this death camp system come online. So this is what we refer to the Operation Reinhardt camps, and they are Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Belzec is the first one and will begin operation in March of 42, and then Sobibor in May, and then Treblinka in July. Tonight I'm really just going to talk about Belzec and Treblinka because those are the where they learn the most. Sobibor is kind of in between. They not all that much changes because of Sobibor. But here you can just see some of the death tolls, and I will say the death tolls do vary. It's difficult. We have a range, so you'll often see a range for these places because it is just difficult to know precisely how many people were killed in exactly these places. So historians are still working with documents and figuring out exactly what those numbers look like. So let's have a look at Belzec. This is a drawing made by a survivor. So here's a map of the camp. Now, you all have been through the exhibit, so you all have a map. You've seen that big white model in the exhibit, so you know the scale of Auschwitz. Look how different this is. This is small. The size of Belzec is the length of 2 soccer fields on each side. So it's not very big. By comparison, Auschwitz is 175 acres. So pretty big. This is pretty small. So it's a small space, and you can see here there's a train track. About 20 cars will be brought into the camp here, and then prisoners will be unloaded and taken to the gas chamber, and then they will be buried in pits. So everyone who's murdered at Belzec will be buried. Later, they'll be exhumed and burned. But initially, this is one of those moments where we talk about how the Nazis are evolving. They really think that they can bury 9.5 million people, right? It's not going to work. They find that out pretty quickly, that that's just not possible. So you can see how far east it is. It's on the very, very edge. In fact, from the camp, you can see the edge with the Soviet Union. So it's on the farthest east part of Poland there. And it lasts for just about 10 months. And in that 10 months, over 400,000 people are killed. Unlike Auschwitz, as you can see, there's not a large prisoner population. There's only 500 people at a time are kept there. So there's not a big number of prisoners. They don't need them. There's no slave labor to do. Basically, the only ones kept alive deal with body disposal or sorting the goods that people brought in. And most surprisingly, 2 survivors. There are thousands of survivors of Auschwitz. Of Belzec, there are 2. That's it. So I think that gives you a sense, too, of how difficult it was to survive a place like this, that we only have 2 people. And think about what that means, too, for the post-war memory, right? We don't have people to tell what their experiences were like of this place because they didn't survive. And consequently, Belzec is one of the death camps that is the least known because we just don't have the stories from it. Mostly Polish Jews are going to Belzec. There will be some from Germany, some from Austria. There'll also be some of the Roma that end up there as well. But by and large, the vast number of people killed here at Belzec are the Polish Jews. There's 2 phases of mass murder at Belzec. The first one, they have gas chambers that are wooden, and they employed Polish workers from the nearby village to come in and build these gas chambers. They described them as sort of like prefab, so they had parts of them that came together. There's a really good documentary called Belzec, and in it they interview a man who, as a teenager, helped construct these gas chambers. And he's, talking to the camera and saying what it was. Did you know what it was? Well, no, not really. And well, it was lined with metal. Why do you think it was lined with metal? Oh, I guess so people couldn't break down the walls. And then the interviewer asked this man to draw a picture of what he built, and he sketches a gas chamber and then goes on with the interview. But before they leave, he walks over and erases it with his foot in the dirt. And it's this really telling moment of, this is a man who's lived here his entire life. He saw this happen, he was a part of it in a strange way, and yet there's still this sort of fear about the whole process. But it's a really excellent documentary. You can find it online. It's just called Belzec. And then the second phase, they replaced the wooden gas chambers and moved them, so they were kind of more centrally located in the camp. They'll move them back to the far edge, and these will be concrete, they're a bit bigger, and then the killing operations will end by December of 42. So it really isn't that long that it's in operation. And then they will also start exhuming all of the people who were killed there and burning them on these makeshift pyres that were made from railroad ties. And then by the spring of 43, they will dismantle the entire camp. So it will be plowed under. The bodies have been exhumed, they've been burned, the buildings were torn down, they're made into rubble. The Nazis will plant trees, and then they will also build a little farmhouse and put a guard there to act like he's been farming the whole time. So when the Soviets come through, this is basically what they see, an empty field, but when you look closely, you can see that there's, kind of some grisly things, some bones, some not quite, thoroughly burned things. So it's clear that like something terrible has happened here, despite the best efforts to sort of plow over it and cover it up. That's basically how it remained until the 60s. In the 60s, the Soviets will put up a couple of memorials that look like this. There's a mention of the Jews that have died there, but also a mention of the many Poles that died there. And so in the area, there was a big misconception that lots more Poles were killed in this camp than is actually true. But that also speaks to the way some of these sites have been used in the post-war world. In 2002, the American Jewish community made big efforts to have a proper memorial made on the site. And so from 2002 to 2004, this is what is constructed. And you can see the entire size of the camp has now been covered in a sort of rubble and rebar. And the reason for that is when even in 2002, when you walked around, you could see ash, you could still see bone fragments, that the whole place was basically a graveyard. And so out of respect for those who died there, they wanted to make sure they could cover it up and make sure that no one was walking on those remains. And so they covered it with this material. The only place you can walk is this narrow ramp that is to symbolize the journey from where the train would have been back to the gas chamber. And even making this trench here was very controversial because that meant for that section of land, you would have to disturb the remains that were there. This issue of dealing with memorialization and how do you handle the issue of human remains is something that we'll talk about more in an upcoming lecture on archaeology and the Holocaust in November. So I encourage you to, it's on Zoom, join us for that one because it will be really interesting where it meets sort of like archaeology and ethics and memorialization. And then just an aerial photo here so you can see, again, the size, not very big, but most strikingly, I think, how close it is to this village of Belzec, just as then as in now. The train station, very close. So here's the train station of Belzec, the same train tracks that brought people to their deaths. Train still runs today. Same building, this is what it looked like in the 40s, this is what it looks like today. If you were standing here on the platform, you could look across and what you would see, not half a mile away, would be the death camp of Belzec. So I always like to use some sort of color photo and put it in a modern context because I think sometimes we forget about how these Holocaust landscapes overlap. That this is still a place where people are living. This is very much a part of our own world. So now if we move on to Treblinka, you can see here some major deportations to Treblinka. Again, this is a place like Belzec that was mainly set up to take the Jews of Poland. And this is what it looks like. So it's a little bit bigger than Belzec. It's 22 acres, but not significantly bigger, certainly not the 175 of Auschwitz. How it's broken down into the portion that deals with the death camp, portion that deals with the goods, where guards lived. And this next series that I'll show you that are in color, these are digital reconstructions that have been made to help us understand the geography of the camp. So when the Jews would arrive in Treblinka, now they've upped their game of deception. So even in Belzec, there was signs in the gas chamber that would say, to the baths, right? So we know that shower deception is something they'd used before. Well, now they've really upped the ante here in Treblinka. So not only will there be the deception of showers, but now there's a fake platform. So when you'd arrive, it's made to look like you have arrived in an actual place. There are signs to tell which towns are near. There's a fake schedule. There's even a fake clock. So lots of things to put people's minds at ease that no, you've arrived in a real place, and that this is you shouldn't worry. You're in some sort of a transit camp, and all will be eventually well. And then there's, even assigned to the Warsaw Jews specifically. And you can tell here, there have been trees that have been woven into the fence to sort of hide what's going on there. As we know, this is something they really dropped that one at Auschwitz, so you don't see that attempt at disguise there. Here's what it looks like. Again, so we've started more of a separation process. This is an area where the women would be taken inside and their hair would be cut. Meanwhile, the men are being undressed outside, and then they will run, so they're here, and they'll start there, and go down what the Nazis refer to as the Himmelstrasse, or road to heaven. So from this changing area, and usually they process the men first, and then they would take the women, they would run them down this stretch. And you can see there's a bend in it, so people can't really see where they're going. And they would make them run because they wanted them to be breathing deeply when they got into the gas chamber, because then they would breathe the gas in faster. They designed this to look like a bathhouse. And here's the inside of the Treblinka gas chambers. They too will use carbon monoxide, also from tank engines. And you can see that the roof is sloped. So initially it was a sloped roof, and then they make a few modifications. They will flatten that because you're just wasting gas by having it go up the distance. And then they will also make the doors a bit larger, so that they can pull the bodies out faster and they can ventilate, get more air in to ventilate faster. So even within one camp, you're going to see adjustments that are happening to make the system a little bit smoother and more efficient, and eventually cost saving if you're saving on gas. And this is a tile that was recovered from the gas chambers. And if you look closely, you can see there's like little bumps on it, little non-slip bumps, because these were tiles that were produced by one of the largest tile companies in Poland that made tiles for swimming pools and bathhouses so that you wouldn't slip. So again, if we're thinking about this level of deception, they've even gone so far to pave the floor. If when you walk into this place, you would see, oh, this looks like maybe I will have a shower, right? So again, thinking about these little details of deception that they really go all out with it at Treblinka. They don't do quite that much at Auschwitz. Body disposal, again, proves to be a huge problem. This is a place where, like Belzec, initially people are buried, and then there has to be a bit of a reorganization, and then they'll begin not only exhuming people that were previously buried, but then they will also just start burning people as opposed to burying them. But again, you can see these sort of makeshift pyres that they've made out of railroad ties to do the job of the burning. Prisoner labor, like I mentioned, the only people that are kept alive are going to be people who are dealing with the goods, so sorting the clothing and everything that is brought in, and then those who are dealing with the body disposal. So you never need more than 500 or 600 prisoners at a time, and it'll be mostly a male workforce. So that's same thing at Belzec. Mostly men are going to be employed in those options, and that's a change. We'll see something different in Auschwitz. So deportations continue, and again, giving you a sense mostly from Poland, but we'll also see some coming from different parts of Europe as well. And then finally, we will see a revolt happen in August of 43. The transportations are slowing, and the prisoners who are still alive understand that eventually the transports are going to stop, and then those prisoners who are alive, then they know they will be killed too. And so they fear for their lives, and sort of a last ditch, we have to do something. They organize a revolt. It happens a little bit sooner than they intend it to. And think too about the difficulty of organizing this revolt, given how disparate the camp was. So it was hard to get the signals across, but they do in fact have a revolt. Many of the prisoners escape. Many of them are killed or recaptured at the end. There are about 57 that successfully escape. And so again, I don't know that all of them survived the war, certainly not. But thinking in terms of how many survivors we have, 2 of Belzec, 50-ish, 40-ish of Treblinka, again gives you a scope of how few are actually surviving. Much like Belzec, they will also tear down anything that's left, destroy the buildings, and put up a farmhouse to act like nothing has happened here. But what's really shocking, especially in the case of Treblinka, that in these 13 months, almost 1 million people are killed. And as you can see, with equipment that is nowhere near what is developed at Auschwitz. Until Auschwitz, Treblinka was the most deadly place on earth in human history. And then it's supplanted by Auschwitz. And this is what it looks like today. Some memorial stones to represent the communities that were lost, and then an aerial photo. Again, not much left there, certainly not a lot of structure left as well. And then that takes us then to Auschwitz. So at the time that Treblinka is at its height of killing with the somewhat rudimentary gas chambers that it has, Auschwitz has not yet developed into a proper death camp that it will eventually be. They've started killing, but the gas chambers that they have in 42 look like this. And again, this is a digital reconstruction as well. Both these two little houses have been torn down since the war, but they're retrofitted farmhouses. These were, farmers lived in these houses, they were moved off the area, and then they boarded up the windows and made them into sort of these little small gas chambers. But this is the first ones that are functioning in Auschwitz. We think about the 4 big cremas that are in Birkenau, but those weren't developed until 1943. So now let's have and I should say, when they're doing the 2 bunkers, they're also burying people. So there isn't a burning crematorium function really happening with with these 2 gas chambers either. They're still mostly burying people. So now I'm going to have like a pause and a rewind just to sort of resituate us. So that's what's happening with the Reinhardt camp. So I want to back us up in time and talk a little bit about how the Nazis actually get to this town in Poland. So if you've been through the exhibit, you know a little bit about that. But once the Germans do invade Poland in 1939, they had this idea of creating this new East and Germanizing parts of it as well. And so they'll rename towns. Auschwitz becomes Auschwitz. And along with that, in this little town, they decide to set up a camp. So this is what Auschwitz, in Auschwitz, this was a Polish military barracks. This is what Auschwitz I looked like when the Nazis first got there. This was a square that was used to break horses. It was, well built. Rudolf Huss, the first commandant, noted this is well built, great structures, but it's pretty run down. It's filled with rats, a lot of repairs needed, but we've got something to work with. This is the form that it takes. You will recognize this gate, and so he'll make it into what we recognize there. So in 1940, Auschwitz isn't a real priority. It's meant to be a camp, much like the camps in Germany. Think of like a Dachau, a Sachsenhausen, places that are meant to hold real or imagined enemies of the state, political prisoners, people who might resist, criminals, that sort of thing. So the first rendition of Auschwitz I is really about that. And that's also why you see that Arbeit macht frei sign that harkens back to Dachau and Sachsenhausen, places like that are, they're not part of a death camp system. That hasn't developed yet. Also, Huss will talk a lot about how difficult it was to gather materials to make this place. He had a hard time finding barbed wire. He couldn't find things because it just wasn't a priority. The initial design and prisoner structure, so again, the first prisoners will be mostly Poles. Jews are not really a part of this design. If Jews wind up there, it's because of some other reason. Prisoners will be processed in, their photos are taken, so later on when we get these mass transports of Jews, they're not being photographed. But here in the early days, you will see people being photographed. No one's being tattooed yet, that comes later. And then we'll see an expansion, the first expansion that happens in 41, and that's because I.G. Farben, and the exhibit points to this as well, I.G. Farben was interested in Auschwitz as a site for a synthetic rubber plant. It was located near, fresh water and lime and coal, all these things that made it a perfect site for a factory. And the SS are thrilled because they think they're going to make a lot of money off this, right? They're going to sell stuff to I.G. Farben, which is a massive company in Germany, and then they're going to use slave labor, and they're going to get paid for that. So it's very exciting for the Nazis because they want to make a bunch of money off it. But first, they invest a ton. So to build this new factory, they invest 600 million Reichsmarks, and they never really get that investment back. It never functions at the level that they think that it will. But it makes them envision this new, very German Auschwitz that doesn't ever quite come into being. At the same time, so shortly after that, we'll take us back to our Operation Barbarossa, where the Nazis are invading the Soviet Union. So at the same time that they're thinking about transforming part of Auschwitz to be this factory, now we're starting to have this, they're moving into the Soviet Union, and they're anticipating lots of Soviet prisoners of war. So there will be another expansion. I'll get to that. There'll be another expansion because they think that they need a place to put all these Soviet prisoners of war. Then there'll be a change in policy, right, as we talked about, because the policy against the Jews will change. So this time period, there's a lot changing, which means that the function of Auschwitz is kind of in flux at this moment. There will be some first gassing experiments that happen in September of 41. This will happen in the basement of Block 11. So again, really a makeshift situation. They board up the windows and put sand, and they do these experiments largely on Soviet POWs. And then this is the first place that they use Zyklon B. So all these other places, they're using carbon monoxide, but they have some Zyklon B on hand because it's an insecticide to kill insects and delouse things. So they have it on hand, and they think, well, if it's a poisonous gas, I bet it will kill people too. And it is, the experiments are effective. So then they will take the crematorium that was in Auschwitz I, because again, a lot of these, all the early camps have crematoriums, but they're small because prisoners are dying and they need to incinerate the bodies. So they have a small crematoria. They will change that around and make it into the first gas chamber in Auschwitz. It's not used all that much. The little bunkers are used far more. And so now we'll see the expansion of Birkenau. They anticipate these Soviet prisoners of war coming. And they will take some Soviet prisoners to build Birkenau. So most of the area of Birkenau is built by Soviets. They have to clear a village that's already there. And so keep in mind, Reinhardt camps are closing. And now, in 43, is when we get this shift to the Auschwitz that we mostly recognize, the building of these three major gas chamber crematorium combos. So Crema 2 is the largest. It's functional. 4 is barely first, but then 2 is the big one that's functional. And you can see these blueprints, furnace room. This was originally designed as a morgue, and they have to change plans a little bit. So this is all underground, this is underground, the changing room, and the gas chamber as well. All of these blueprints, many of them were destroyed at the very end of the war, or the businesses that worked with the Nazis destroy their copies. But the Soviets, when they liberate Auschwitz, they are able to capture some of these documents. And so after the fall of the Soviet Union, we were able to get a lot of these documents back and have a look at how these things were actually designed. You can see some of the building of it. So in Crema 2, it was an expensive building. It cost almost $4 million in today's money. The other crematoriums will cost about $2 million. Crema 2 was the largest. It costs about $4 million. It often has problems, and I won't belabor all the details of each of these crematoriums, but I think it's worth noting some of the problems because, again, we think about this ingenuity and what great engineering it is. And in actuality, there are a lot of problems that happen along the way. 2 is often out of service. It has a lot of problems with its smokestack, mostly because the Nazis are overusing it. Topf and Sons, who helped design these buildings, they told them to only burn this many people. And the Nazis went ahead and burned almost 43% more than they were told to, which resulted in massive damage to the smokestack. So then they had to shut it down, and then the engineers had to come out and work on it. And of course, everyone's upset because their crematoriums are out of order. Today, if you went to Auschwitz, this is what you would see. It was blown up on January 20th ahead of the Soviet army, and the furnaces and chimneys had been removed. So it's, again, there's not much left. This is a model of what it looked like. So you can see the people, this is the changing room, and then again, the gas chamber. In this changing room, they would have benches, there'd be signs that would say things like, not just to the showers, but just like one lice causes death, and like lots of, you know, cleanly propaganda. And they'd be in many languages too, so to make sure that people would understand them. They'd be reminded by the Sonderkommando, to the fellow prisoners that had to do this job, they'd be reminded to, you know, make sure that you remember which hook your clothes are on and tie your shoes together, and maybe here's a piece of soap or a towel. So lots of things to help people think that they were in fact headed towards a shower. And then here's, and if you were in the exhibit, you will recognize this column, right? So this is the gas chamber, the column that would be, you can see the top of it there, where the crystals would, the Zyklon B crystals would be lowered down. When they hit the air, they form this poisonous vapor. That is if the air temperature is warm enough. As you probably know, it gets kind of cold in Poland, and so sometimes in the depths of winter it was a little bit cold and the gas wouldn't diffuse, so then they had to go back and see, can we heat this up? How can we change it to make sure that the gas is properly disseminating? Then the bodies would be moved up by elevator, right here, to this main level where the burn cells would be. And these elevators, again, was a real point of engineering. They have to bear a lot of weight repeatedly. And so when they first construct them, they have a hard time finding elevator parts. Where can they buy them? Can they take them from a nearby warehouse? Where can they get something that will work? And initially the ones that they get break. So there's a lot of parts breaking in almost all of these buildings. And then you can see again, sometimes the Sonderkommando were housed above. Sometimes they would use this area up here to dry out hair that they had previously shaved before they can take it someplace else. Crema 4 also has some problems. You can see it being built. I like the construction photos again because it reminds us that these were buildings that had to be designed, that someone had to figure out how to put them together. Crema 4 also has some difficulties and some rough beginnings. Initially it doesn't quite work, there's not enough airflow. The guys have to get on top of the roof to drop down the crystals, and they, you know, for each column they have to get on the roof and drop them down. Apparently this was a very precarious, cumbersome process on this particular building, and people complained about it, so they had to redesign some of those things. The furnace keeps breaking. The furnace in 4 was always faulty. It developed these big cracks and could never really run as hot as they wanted it to. And again, you can see it was blown up. It was damaged in the Sonderkommando uprising. And then Crema 5, smaller, also had a fragile furnace that eventually they stopped using. So 4 and 5's furnaces are often such a disaster that they stop using them and will start burning bodies outside in pits. Go. And then Crema 3, like 2, very similar to 2, and it was also quite large, but not as large as the others. You can just see some of those. And then here we have the death tolls. And so you can see again the capacity that these places have. So when we do think about Auschwitz in this finished final form of engineering, they do get there, right? This is the factory. We're seeing these factory numbers of efficiency. At the same time, they're creating this as they go. And so I mentioned, there's a lot of discussion between the Nazis and then the businesses, Topf & Sons, the engineers who are creating this, and a lot of back and forth about how to do it, because while crematoriums existed and while they had done gas chambers in a particular way, nobody had put them together before. And there's a lot to figure out in that process, and it takes them a while to get it right. And even when they do get it right, they also get a lot wrong. And then there are also skirmishes between the two, because the Nazis say, well, your product broke. And then Topf & Sons says, well, you basically voided the warranty because you burned more people than we told you to. Well, who's going to pay for this? So again, there's this sort of like mundane business. A contractor is, sending a bill and the client is unhappy with the work that's done and the price they have to pay. Right? That's part of our modern world. And that's part of the world that this came from as well. So now it takes the form that we see it. Thinking again back to those camps that I showed you earlier, this is huge. Why is it so big? It's so big because people can be selected in for slave labor. None of those other camps had a slave labor component. Auschwitz does. So they will have about 100,000 people living in this complex, more when you combine the other subcamps in Auschwitz I and Bunamonowitz. So there's a lot of people that are here. And there is a women's camp. Those other camps really didn't have, Sobibor had a few women there, but definitely Treblinka and Belzec, women were not selected in to do any sort of work. At Auschwitz, there were some. And so again, you can see all these things here. And Canada, we'll talk about that in a second, where all the goods were taken. Zyklon B, I just like to show these things because, again, this is part of the modern business world. People, they're ordering this from a company who is providing it for a fee. This one here is one of my favorites because it says, like, attention, warning smell, we've taken it out. So the Nazis requested from IG Farben, who is making the Zyklon B, they say, we don't need that warning smell, right? So IG Farben should have had a pretty good idea. Well, if you don't want the warning smell, you're probably gassing something other than lice. And it reminds us, too, this sort of corporate complicity and the fact that lots of people are making money. Other quick modifications, you can see the ramps going into Auschwitz. First prisoners were unloaded here in the C location, and then there, and eventually D. And then, ahead of the Hungarian transport, they now built a railroad spur that goes directly in. So we think about this as arrival, and that railroad spur in didn't really exist here until 44. Just a quick timeline to give us a sense of when it's active, so when the transports are coming in. So there's a lot of activity here, and then sort of nothing until May, when the Hungarians arrive. So the Hungarian transports, you saw a lot of that in the exhibit. It was the last intact Jewish community to be taken. In a span of just over 50 days, we see over 400,000 people are transported to Auschwitz. The vast majority of those are killed upon arrival. But there is a selection process here at Auschwitz, right? There was no selection process in those Reinhardt camps. People arrived and they were killed immediately. Here, there will be a selection process for immediate annihilation and then later. Also, some of you may have joined us earlier in the year for one of our Zoom presentations on the Auschwitz album. If you didn't, I really encourage you to go to our website and find the video of Dr. Franz Sternberg talking about the Auschwitz album. Breaks down these photos really nicely. So again, if you saw those in the exhibit and you see them here, if you have any interest in that, I really recommend it. And then here's just some of the goods that people brought with them, and we have the male side of the Canada Commando moving the items. Then people, if they had been selected in, would be processed. They would get all of their bodily hair shaven, and they would get a tattoo. Auschwitz is the only camp where prisoners were tattooed. The initial tattoos were up on the chest, and then they shift to the arm. It's interesting, one of my points I always like to make about gender in the Holocaust is that everyone arriving who goes through this process has both their hair shaved and a tattoo put on their arm. But very frequently, female survivors will talk about the trauma of being naked and shaved in public and in front of men, while male survivors very often emphasize the shame of their name being replaced with a number. So it's really interesting to think about how pre-war gender roles brings us to these moments of the same, people having the same experience, yet are having different traumas as a result. They'd be given a uniform, and then here it took about, except at the height of the Hungarian transport where there was a delay, typically it took about the same amount of time to be processed into the camp as it did to be killed in the gas chambers. Because the Hungarian transports were so many and the gas chamber, the crematoriums are having such struggles, they can't keep up. And so you see people who are waiting outside Crema 5 and in other places to be gassed because they can't get in fast enough. And they also have to bring back one of the little bunkers because the 4 big gas chambers can't handle it. And then they also start burning people outside. People who come to Auschwitz, largely, I mentioned with the other places, they were largely getting the Polish Jewish population. Auschwitz will get a much more international one. So we'll see from Belgium and France, Greece, all across Europe, you will see people transported. And think about how long those train journeys would have been. You can see again a breakdown of the numbers and the variety of countries. So thinking about how this weighs in our public consciousness too, not only was it possible to survive Auschwitz because there was a slave labor component that wasn't in these other death camps, but there's such an international component to it as well that all the people who do survive are from all of these countries, so we're going to get a much more global memory, essentially. And then just in terms of numbers deported, you can see this is who's deported. And this is, I think, interesting because you can see the mortality rate. So, 91% of the Jews who go to Auschwitz do die. 50% of the Poles who were sent there. But the Soviet prisoners of war, 99% of the Soviet prisoners of war who end up in Auschwitz are killed there. So their survival rate is basically non-existent. Very, very quickly, I'll just go through some prisoners' life and structure. They heavily rely on a prisoner structure. There's not enough guards to take care of everything, so they will force other prisoners to be part of that structure. Food is something that is often a source of violence because it's, of course, that's what you need to live. So you have minimal rations, and because of that, there's going to be a lot of stealing among prisoners. They call it organizing. That's something that's mentioned in the exhibit as well. If we think about the difficulty of surviving, one thing I think people often don't think about is the language problems, that all the orders would be given in German. Can you speak German? Can you understand? Some of it, do you know someone who does? If you had good language skills, you'd have you'd have better chances for survival in some ways because you could avoid beatings, you could know where you needed to go. So there's just some things like that to think about. There'd be work assignments, they would vary. Where you were put, again, would be a huge factor in how well you might be able to survive. Factory work would be preferable to being outside. Just a few more. Again, I like these photos because it really shows some of the labor, and they're different photos than we typically see of just people arriving. And then one of the best jobs you could have, of course, is a job in the Canada Commando, because you would be able to deal with a lot of the stuff that people brought. And even though it was technically against the rules to take it, it meant that you had access to things. You could barter and trade, and that could keep you alive a little bit longer. You can see there was a lot of women who were involved in the sorting. And this picture is also in the exhibit. This one is interesting because you can see this woman here. If you look real close, you can see that she's smiling. And she actually survived, and she remembers the moment that photo was taken. And it was an SS man who made her smile, like he's taking these photos and tells her to smile. But if you just see it, you think, oh, does she enjoy this work? Is it not that bad? But she remembers that moment of conflict of having to smile for the camera. Medical experiments happen. Also, they talk about this in the exhibit, so that's something, if you weren't killed immediately, you might have medical experiments done on you. There is resistance, many forms of resistance. The exhibit covers that very well. Not just armed resistance, but spiritual resistance. These are some of the photos that were taken secretly to show the process of what was happening, and then they were smuggled out. Women were involved in the Sonderkommando uprising. They smuggled in the gunpowder and other things needed. They were tortured and did not break even after a week of torture. It was successful in the sense that they do postpone some things. Crema 4 is set on fire. It's never used for gassing again. They kill a few SSS men, 3, and about 450 the Sonderkommando will die. And then at the end, we'll see, as things are winding down, gassings end in November, and then as winter sets in ahead of the Red Army, we will see death marches out of Auschwitz. And again, this is a real difference than the other places, because in the other death camps, everyone was killed and then they plowed it under. But the people who do survive, a few are left behind, and the Soviets will eventually liberate them. But mostly, those survivors who are left alive are moved into Western camps. So we see what the Soviets do here. Again, the Soviets are the ones who reach all of the other death camp facilities. Americans, the Western Allies, don't reach any of the primary killing facilities. The Soviets get all of those. So when they do have liberation, you can see here some of the liberation photos that they staged some days after actual liberation. But here's some of the first impressions. I like these because they're so much more honest than those propaganda photos. You can see these were done. This is a photo taken. This is a piece that was drawn by one of the Soviet liberators, much more grim. We have some of the similar ones. And some of those are also featured in the exhibit as well. They will attempt to do some sort of help, not as much as what we see happening in the West. And then we'll see burials. And again, this is very different from what they find in other death camps, that everyone has already been killed. But here they find some people that have just died, and they're few enough that they can actually provide, coffins and graves for them. And then the Soviets will start investigating the crime. And I think this is also interesting because immediately they start looking at what was done here, what is the equipment that's left, and they form a commission that's to decide, what happened here. They carry out these post-mortem examinations of bodies. So they do a fair amount of fact-finding quickly enough that by May 7th, 1945, the war isn't even over, right? The war ends the next day. By May 7th, the Extraordinary State Commission has published their findings on what happened at Auschwitz. And what's significant to us right now is that they do not state the Jews were the largest group. They don't mention Jews. They talk about people by nationality or ethnicity, but they don't talk about the Jews being the largest group. They leave that out. And they have this they come to the misconclusion that 4 million people were killed. And then this is just, the Soviets will reuse Birkenau briefly as a POW camp before they finally tear down most of it. And then in 1947, it will be made into a memorial site. So really quickly, it is situated as a memorial site by the Soviets. But the trick is, it's dedicated to those who were killed by fascists. The Jewishness of this site isn't mentioned, and because they situate most of the memorialization at Auschwitz I that did deal with Polish death and mostly non-Jewish death, they're really focusing the story on that. The site at Birkenau was technically preserved, but didn't have a lot of formal memorialization until much later. And then you can see, again, just thinking about memorialization, what's left there, shoes, hair, and then we have a good aerial to show, in comparison to the other ones that I showed you, you can just get a sense of the scope there, 175 acres. And the town, much like then and today, really runs through all of it. So Auschwitz III down, where is it, down here, and it's down here. And then there's the first one, but it's really, in the middle of quite a lot here. So again, if we come back to this idea of Belzec was a laboratory, Auschwitz was a factory, you can see that development, how they didn't start with this finished final form of precision engineering, and even though they do get all 4 of those crematoriums functioning, there's not a lot of precision to it, right? It's a constant state of breaking and fixing and figuring out something new. But I think it adds a lot to the story, as Jessica mentioned in the introduction. It adds a lot to our understanding if we can see this as an evolution, a place they eventually get to, rather than a starting point.